The canned goods aisle looks exactly the same as it did last year. Same labels, same shelf placement, same prices on most things you'd grab without thinking. That sameness is exactly why it's worth a second look, because underneath it, a dozen different supply chains are pulling in completely different directions at once. Picture 12 cans lined up on a counter. Some of them are cheaper to make this year. Some are sitting on a factory closure most shoppers never heard about. One of them is being squeezed by a federal rule that took effect on New Year's Day. If your family buys any of these regularly, this is worth watching closely, not because everything is about to disappear, but because a full-looking shelf and a stable price aren't the same guarantee they used to be. 12 cans, least urgent to most. Let's start with the ones you can mostly relax about. Number 12, canned pears. What makes this one different is that it started with a factory closing, not a farm failing. When Del Monte shut down its Modesto processing plant this year, a real question opened up over who would keep packing California's pear crop at all. Pacific Coast Producers, a cooperative representing roughly 160 family farms, stepped in and bought Del Monte's shelf-stable fruit assets, publicly committing to hold canned pear volume steady. Around two-thirds of California's pear crop goes into processed products like this one, and the industry's own advisory board called maintaining that tonnage critical. Picture a factory going dark on a Friday and a buyer signing the paperwork before the following season even starts. That's essentially what happened here. What a shopper sees is a can that costs about what it did last year. What almost happened underneath that calm shelf was a real gap in who was going to buy the fruit at all. The pears found a buyer. The peaches, a few items from now, didn't. If canned pears are a household regular, this is one of the lower priority items to stock ahead on. A can or two extra costs little and keeps for 2 to 3 years in a cool pantry, but there's no urgent reason to load up. Number 11, canned corn. Most shoppers overlook corn completely, and there's a real argument they're right to. Corn is one of the most abundantly grown commodity crops in the country, spread across a wide domestic footprint that isn't dependent on any single region's weather the way a specialty fruit crop is. That breadth is what makes it resistant to the kind of single-point failure driving several other items on this list. Think about what it would take to actually threaten this supply. Not one bad harvest in one state, but a bad harvest across dozens of states simultaneously. That's the built-in insurance policy corn carries that almost nothing else on this list has. Corn has a weather advantage. A few items from now, green beans have an import problem. Same shelf, same size can, completely different exposure. If you rotate through canned vegetables regularly, corn is one of the safer bets here, simply because there's little evidence pointing toward near-term pressure. Speaking of things running smoother than expected this year, there's a protein category sitting nearby doing something similar. Worth knowing before we go further, the sealed tin can traces back to a French confectioner in the early 1800s, solving food preservation for Napoleon's army decades before the can opener was even invented to make opening one practical. Number 10. Canned chicken and broth-based soups. At first glance, this one looks like it should be caught in the same protein squeeze hitting red meat elsewhere in the store. It isn't, and the reason comes down to a genuinely different production cycle. Broiler production is expanding this year, with output forecasts raised on stronger slaughter numbers and heavier average bird weights, and the national wholesale chicken price is actually forecast slightly lower than last year. Picture two production lines side by side, one raising cattle that takes years to scale up, one raising chickens that can scale up in months. That gap in flexibility is the entire reason this item and the one at the very top of this list are living in completely different worlds right now. If your family leans on canned chicken or broth-based soups for quick dinners, this is one of the calmer categories here, with no particular urgency beyond normal rotation. There's one more category that looks worse in the headlines than it actually is once you check what's really happening on the shelf. Number 9. Canned tomatoes and tomato paste. Here's where things get interesting, because canned tomatoes have been sitting in the middle of a genuine crisis this year without actually being part of it. Fresh tomatoes have taken a real hit. New tariffs near 17% on Mexican imports, freeze damage across Florida, wholesale prices at their highest levels in a quarter century. It would be reasonable to assume canned tomatoes and paste are caught in the same wave. Most people don't realize processing tomatoes and fresh tomatoes aren't really the same supply chain at all. The variety that ends up canned is largely grown in California's Central Valley and harvested later in the summer, on a different calendar entirely from the fresh tomatoes hit hardest by tariffs and freezes. An analyst tracking the produce market said plainly that processing tomatoes haven't been affected the way fresh ones have. If your household leans on canned tomatoes for sauces, chili, or soup, this is one of the more reassuring items on this whole list, genuinely more sheltered than the headlines about tomatoes would suggest. Not every canned fruit shares that kind of shelter, though. Notice what's happening across these last 4 items: pears, corn, chicken, tomatoes. 4 completely different products, 4 completely different reasons for staying calm. That's about to change. Number 8. Canned peaches. The surprising part of this one is that it's the same event as the pear story, with the opposite outcome. When Del Monte closed its Modesto plant, it didn't just create a question mark over pears, it eliminated processing capacity for more than 30% of California's clingstone peaches, the variety grown almost exclusively for canning. That left an estimated 50,000 tons of peaches without a buyer this season, serious enough that USDA approved close to $9 million to fund removing as many as 420,000 clingstone trees ahead of this year's harvest. The peaches lost a factory, the pears found a buyer, same news event, same week, 2 completely different endings. And that's exactly why they sit next to each other on this list, instead of being treated as one story. If peaches are a pantry staple in your house, this is worth buying a little ahead on, not because of an immediate spike, but because the industry supplying it is visibly shrinking. That same kind of consolidation shows up again in a completely different vegetable, just a couple of items from here. Quick thing worth checking on your next trip. Canned goods don't need refrigeration, but they do best stored below roughly 75 degrees. A pantry near a hot stove or garage wall can quietly shorten shelf life by years on a can that still looks perfectly fine. Number 7. Canned green beans. Picture 2 vegetables sitting on the same shelf, both canned, both green, both facing completely different realities. Canned green beans lean heavily on imports from Mexico and Guatemala to maintain the year-round availability American shoppers expect, since domestic production alone can't cover every season. That import dependence has translated into a long, steady climb in prices for both the fresh and processed product, driven by production costs, transportation, and quality gaps between growing regions. If your family buys green beans regularly, this is worth watching more closely than corn, not because of one dramatic event, but because the underlying import reliance is structural and isn't going anywhere. Vegetables aren't the only category quietly shifting because of pressure building somewhere else in the store, though. Number 6. Canned beans. You've probably noticed ground beef getting more expensive without necessarily connecting it to the bean aisle. As red meat prices climb, more households are substituting toward plant-based protein for weeknight meals, and canned black, kidney, and pinto beans are direct beneficiaries of that shift. At the same time, the supply side is genuinely improving. Dry bean exports have been declining, meaning more of the domestic crop is staying inside the country instead of shipping overseas, which should support availability even as demand climbs. This is a real push-pull. Rising demand pulling one direction, improving domestic supply pulling the other. Think about a scale with a heavier weight slowly landing on each side at the same time. That's this item exactly. If beans are becoming a bigger part of how your household manages protein costs, a reasonable buffer makes sense here, less because of scarcity and more because demand is climbing faster than most people have noticed. Once you start looking at ingredients instead of finished products, one canned staple manages to stack nearly every pressure on this list into a single can. Number 5. Canned soup. This is the one that fooled me a little because canned soup doesn't have a single supply chain. It has 4 or 5, all layered into one product. A typical vegetable or beef-based soup pulls together produce that may cross a tariffed border, meat tied to the same cattle cycle pressuring ground beef, and packaging using steel or aluminum carrying its own separate cost increase. None of those pressures are dramatic individually. Stacked into one can, they compound in a way single-ingredient products simply don't. Imagine 4 small weights, each one barely noticeable on its own, all resting on the same shelf at the same time. That's what's actually sitting inside a can of soup right now. That's part of why manufacturers have quietly adjusted recipes and package sizes over the past couple of years, even when no single ingredient spiked hard enough to explain it alone. If soup is a weeknight staple, treat it as one of the more exposed items here, not because of one dramatic cause, but because it's absorbing several smaller ones at once. Some of what we've covered so far is still working its way toward the shelf. This next one already landed. Number 4. Canned tropical fruit. Nobody expects a can of pineapple to be a leading indicator of anything, but the data here is some of the most concrete on this entire list. Retail audits earlier this year tracked Dole canned pineapple sourced from Southeast Asia, up roughly 25% at major retailers, with the company publicly citing tariffs on Southeast Asian imports, alongside weather-related crop shortages as the direct cause. That's not a forecast. That's a documented increase that's already reached the shelf. USDA's own outlook has processed fruits and vegetables broadly climbing another 4% this year, and canned tropical fruit sits closer to the sharp end of that range than the average. Different food, same pattern we've seen twice already this list. A headline-driven cost hits a specific supply corridor, and there's simply no fast substitute waiting in the wings. If pineapple, mandarin oranges, or mixed tropical fruit cups are pantry regulars, this is a category where the increase isn't a risk to plan around. It already happened, with further movement still likely. Fruit isn't the only category facing a real ceiling on supply, though. Number 3. Canned salmon. Here's a distinction worth sitting with. Canned salmon is being squeezed from a direction almost nobody expects, which is regulation, not weather or trade policy. A new federal rule tied to the Marine Mammal Protection Act took effect on the 1st of this year, tightening import requirements around wild-caught seafood. Layer that on top of tightened fishing quotas for wild Pacific salmon, responding to genuine population declines in key fishing regions, and you get a supply pool shrinking from 2 directions at once. Less can legally be caught, and less can be imported without meeting stricter new standards. Picture a door narrowing from both sides at the same time, not because anyone's blocking it deliberately, but because 2 separate rules both tightened in the same year. Industry sourcing data already shows buyers shifting toward farmed salmon as the economics of wild-caught tighten at scale, which matters if the nutritional gap between wild and farmed is something your household cares about. If genuinely wild-caught canned salmon matters to you, this is worth buying ahead on, because the option to buy it at all may narrow faster than the price does. There's a cousin to this fish sitting 2 aisles over, carrying a very different kind of exposure. Number 2, canned tuna. Of everything on this list, this is the one where I want to be the most careful not to overstate what the data actually shows. Roughly 55 to 60% of the tuna that ends up in an American can arrives through Southeast Asia, and that corridor is sitting under real, active tariff pressure, with some country-specific proposals running into the mid-40% range. That's a documented structural vulnerability, sitting on a product where import dependence exceeds 85% of total domestic supply. Here's the honest part. Most other channels won't say clearly. What hasn't happened yet, according to the pricing data available right now, is a confirmed broad retail increase tied specifically to that exposure. Picture a bridge under a weight limit sign that hasn't been tested yet. The sign is real, the load hasn't actually broken anything, and both facts matter equally. So the honest version of this one is real risk, sitting on one of the highest volume proteins in the entire pantry aisle, without a confirmed price move to point to just yet. That combination of scale and exposure is exactly why it ranks this high, despite the uncertainty. Every item on this list, no matter which direction its price is heading, shares one thing in common, and it's about to close out this entire video. Number 1. The can itself. Every item so far has had its own individual story. A fishery, a farm, a trade rule, a factory closing. This last one is different because it isn't really about what's inside any single can. It's about the can. Steel and aluminum tariffs were doubled to 50% earlier this year, and tin plate steel, the specific material most food cans are made from, is overwhelmingly imported, since domestic production capacity has collapsed by roughly 75% since 2018 as manufacturing lines shut down one after another. Consumer price data already shows canned vegetable prices moving in response, with a documented lag between when tariffs rise and when that cost actually reaches a shelf price. Can manufacturers have been public about the fact that cost increases from the past year were largely passed straight through to customers already? Picture the metal wrapper costing more to produce than the food sealed inside it. That's not a metaphor at this point. It's close to literal for some of the lower cost items on this list. Contracts in this industry are typically renegotiated once a year in the fall, meaning further increases are already expected to land between now and 2027. The can became more expensive than the food inside it. That's the one sentence worth remembering from this entire list. Because unlike a bad harvest or a shifting trade rule, there's no spare domestic manufacturing capacity sitting in reserve anywhere to absorb the difference. This is the item with no quick fix: 12 cans. And if there's one thing worth taking from all of them together, it's that a full-looking shelf and a stable price aren't the same guarantee they used to be. Pears found a buyer at the last minute. Peaches didn't. Tomatoes turned out to be sheltered from a crisis that looked like it should have caught them. Corn and chicken are simply having a calm year, for reasons that have nothing to do with luck. And underneath every single can on this list, whether the food inside it is getting cheaper or more expensive, sits a packaging cost that's been climbing steadily with no sign of turning around before 2027. None of this calls for clearing a shelf or treating a grocery trip like an emergency. It calls for buying a little more intentionally, rotating what you already use, weighing where the real pressure sits against where it's just noise, and letting your own household's habits decide what's worth a few extra cans this month. The families who come out ahead aren't the ones who panic first. They're the ones who can tell the difference between a can that's calm because nothing's wrong and one that's calm because someone else already stepped in to fix it. Which of these 12 hit closest to home for you? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. If this was useful, a like helps it reach more people trying to make sense of their own grocery bill, and subscribing keeps you covered as these trends keep shifting through the rest of the year.